Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us on our weekly AJA Zoom event, and welcome to any new people joining us this week. Also, we welcome those watching on Facebook, and to anybody listening to the audio replay, which is broadcast every Thursday at midday and Sundays at 4 p.m. on J-Air Community Radio, which you can find at FM 88 in Melbourne or at j-air.com.au. My name is Alan Friedman, Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association. You will see David Adler, President of the AJA, also on your screen, as well as our guest for tonight, Barry Shaw, and he's a blogger. He runs a blog called The View from Israel. Tonight's topic, of course, is an update on the Israeli election, and what we might do is just leave a few minutes at the end so that we can get a little bit of an update on Biden's visit before we finish. Barry will do a presentation for us this evening, and then we'll take questions as usual. And if you want to ask a question and not sure how we do it, we ask you to raise your hand electronically, and you can do that by clicking the reaction icon down the bottom. That lets us know that you want to ask a question, because we need to give you the option of unmuting before we can take the question. Robert Gregory is back from his holidays. He's our Director of Public Affairs, and he will read out any written questions on the chat function that may come up if you want to put a question there. And a reminder also that you can disable the chat if you find it annoying. Well, as we all know, Israelis are headed back to the polling booths for another election, the fifth in 4 years, and it's hard to watch all this from the other side of the world without concluding that their political system is in dire need of reform. Naftali Bennett appears to have bailed out of the process, and Bibi Netanyahu is always ready to reclaim the crown that he says was unfairly taken from him. In Yair Lapid, Israel has now got either a centrist or a left-wing prime minister, depending on your point of view, largely as a result of the right-wing parties squabbling over Netanyahu's future role in Israel. So what's the current situation? Barry Shaw is a Senior Associate for Public Diplomacy at the Israeli Institute of Strategic Studies. He is also the author of some books. They're called Fighting Hamas, BDS and Anti-Semitism, 1917 From Palestine to the Land of Israel, BDS for Idiots, and his latest work called A Tale of Love and Destiny is a dramatic life of a Jewish heroine. Back in April 2020, Barry was our very first Zoom guest, so it's great to have him back. Barry, welcome back, and thanks for your time.
Thank you, Alan. I'm sorry I'm wearing this pilot's outfit, but obviously my other system didn't work.
No, not a problem. Now, we've got some slides. I think David's going to manage those for you. Okay. So do you want to just start talking, or do you want to see the slides first?
No, just let me rip. First of all, it's good to see Michael again. Michael, I enjoyed our Netanya breakfast together. It didn't just fill our stomachs, but we had a very nice brainstorming session. Okay, to the subject. Israel is heading to the election on the 1st of November, and this is our fifth election in 3.5 years. I think we want to break the Italian record. On the surface, we could put up slide number 1 if you wish, David. On the surface, this is about inflation and the cost of living. And any of you who visited Israel, eaten out, hired a car, filled it up your tank, you know what I'm talking about. Try being a young couple, trying to buy a flat with a mortgage, or even renting an apartment, paying electricity, municipal taxes, food. And you can see everybody's feeling the pinch. Now, Bibi, always the opportunist, of course, did a promo for the elections. He went to a gas station to make a video blaming the current government for the rising gas prices. Its cynicism wasn't lost on a lot of people who were asking, when was the last time that Bibi and Genuine went to a gas station to fill up, and really did he feel the financial pain? And some reminded us that when he was in power, and his government raised petrol prices, he did a Biden and blamed somebody else, because at that time he said even Barack Obama can't stop prices from going up. Now, most Israelis are looking at these elections with cynicism and anger. The last thing they really needed was another election. As I said, they feel the economic pain as they watch Knesset members about to blow hundreds of millions of shekels on election expenses. And we know that the November election will probably not solve the problem, a political problem, and the logjam that Israel finds itself in. We may end up with a series of elections. So let me guide you through the maze of Israeli election politics and horse trading. Starting with slide number 2, David, if you have it. Some people predict a return of Bibi. He's still tied up with his trial. So let me cover that. How is it possible that he's on trial of charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in 3 separate cases? First, his supporters echo Bibi himself by saying that, rather like what the Democrats, I guess, are doing in America against Trump, it's a witch hunt to try and bring down Benjamin Netanyahu and keep him from office. And also Bibi himself is claiming his innocence. But if the attitude of the people who support him said if they can't beat him at the polls, then they recruit the police and the judiciary to try and bring him down. Now, Bibi's always claimed it is innocent because there's nothing there. That's what keeps repeating itself. For example, the case against him right now that's been going on the last week or two for receiving tens of thousands of dollars worth of pink champagne and the most expensive and rare cigars smells like gifts for favors. Also, friend, I want to tell you, cringeworthy, especially as most of the demands were coming from Bibi's wife, Sarah, who is referred disrespectfully here in Israel as Miss Piggy from the Muppet Show. However, the prosecution seems to be failing to link personal gifts from wealthy friends into something criminal. And how a person can run for the most powerful position in the land while standing trial, well, a bill barring anybody under criminal indictment from serving as prime minister was introduced by the coalition lawmakers in June, as recently as June, but they didn't progress. This was a failure of the anti-Bibi coalition, united in the cause of Ratlo Bibi, meaning anyone except Bibi, yet still unable to pass legislation that would have prevented him from running again in the election. And if Bibi's Likud gains power, they will enforce radical reforms, we assume, reducing the powers of the judiciary and possibly even the police from meddling in politics. And the opposition fears a future Netanyahu government that could reintroduce what's known here as the French law. What's the French law? This prevents a sitting prime minister from being prosecuted while serving in office. The opposition also fears that Netanyahu may appoint a new attorney general who will agree to a favorable plea bargain in his case, in his deal, especially if he's found guilty, that doesn't include a prison term or even moral turpitude clause that would stop Bibi from serving in public office. So I hope that has covered a lot of the things to do with the legal aspect of what Bibi is about right now. The opposition also fears that Bibi may appoint, I mentioned this, a new attorney general, and that, could help it. Now, having said that, Netanyahu's body language has shown a lot of confidence that he's on his way back to power. He promised to restore national pride to the citizens of Israel. But will he unify the country or divide it? So let's see. Next slide, if you could, David, please. His main rival is Yair Lapid. who used Bibi's words by saying, and I quote, "We need to go back to the idea of Israeli unity and not let the forces of darkness divide us from within," accusing Bibi of being a two-faced. Another slide, please, if you'd have it, David. Lapid pointed out the diversity of the coalition government, which was right, center, left, and even Arab parties in the last government, to prove his point. And then he turned to the differing character and internal tone of his and Bennett's coalition, as opposed to the Bibi's bloc, by saying, and I quote again, this is from Yair Lapid, "You can have different politics in Israel, not the politics of hatred, but the politics of cooperation." Next slide, please, David. Now, let's look at what happened to some of the members of the party in his coalition and the current caretaker government, because it points to where things are heading right now prior to the November election. Another slide, David, please. The Meretz Party is a hard left socialist party. It was headed by Nitzan Horowitz, who was the health minister under Bennett. And he announced, surprisingly, that he'd remain in the party, but he didn't want to head it leading into the next election. Next slide, David, please. The person who was expected to replace Horowitz as head of the Meretz Party was Tamar Sandberg. Sandberg, by the way, participated in a protest against Israeli occupation outside the AIPAC conference in America a few years back, which illustrates how left her party is. But she surprised everybody when gifted the leadership of the party. She said, no, thank you. She was taking time out from politics. Now, the Meretz Party is teetering on the brink of extinction, and polls indicate that they won't make the threshold in the next election if they're going it alone. So what has been happening with this party, with both Horowitz leading and Sandberg not taking the party, party must receive, I have to tell you, 3.25% of the vote in order to get a mandate into the Knesset. Now, the political parties would like to lower this threshold to make it easier to get in, but actually the public would like this figure raised to possibly even 5%. But we'll see. Now, the next slide, David. The Meretz leadership problem is seen with the next in line. This man is Yair Golan. He was once the deputy IDF chief of staff, and he's proven to himself to be, even in that job, as a radical leftist during his military service. He was fond of removing Jewish settlers, calling them, and I quote, subhumans and Nazis. And this has made him unpopular, even in his own hard left party. So next slide, David, please. And this is called the base to call for the return of a distant past Meretz leader called Zahava Galon. And as of a few days ago, she agreed to run against Golan for a Galon-Golan contest in order to lead Meretz into the next election. Next slide, David, please. Some said that her leadership will draw votes away from the Labour Party, led by Merav Michaeli. Now, Michaeli denies it, but she has moved the traditional Labour Party to the left, even going to the far left, in fact, stepping on the toes of Meretz. We have to remember that the Labour Party was the Labour Party of David Ben-Gurion, really the center and the heart of Zionism and Israel. So in the last coalition government, Michaeli's role was one of transport minister. And what we saw is partly as a result of a job success or failure is the most massive traffic jams in Israel. Anybody who's going to the airport or been to the airport, probably Michael would know to this, you have to go there about 4, even 5 hours before your flight and stand in unbearably long lines. And also the most important thing was a failure to pass the vitally important metro law. The metro law is one that would give Tel Aviv and its suburbs a massive underground rail service. And this was supposed to have been the pet project, the crowning project of both the current government, the government before it, and of Michaeli and even of Victor Lieberman as the economy ministry. But it got delayed by the Likud opposition to it, who didn't want to give the coalition any legislative success, even on a major project so necessary in Israel as the metro bill ahead of an election. Now, it could be that if Zava Galon drags votes, she will drag them from the Labour Party of Michaeli. And Labour is in fact itself in danger of not making the cut into the Knesset. So my opinion right now, and we still have time to go, is that they will be a Labour Merits link-up, a bloc, in order to ensure they gain representation together, not separately, in the next election. Next slide, David, please. Victor Lieberman was the economy minister in the last coalition government. And prior to that, he served in the Netanyahu government. But he, together with Bennett, Gantz, Saar, said they were finished with what they described as Bibi's demagoguery. Now, it remains to be seen what he will be doing this year in this election. Let me tell you something about Lieberman. He is a politician who went with Bibi because of his dislike of the Arab Knesset parties, who he saw as more representing the enemies of Israel than representing the interests of Israeli Arabs. But once ensconced with the Likud, he developed a political animus of the religious parties, who he saw as taking taxpayers' money, but not giving any civil duty, including military service, spending their days studying Torah and not learning the skills that would make them, in his eyes, productive, helpful members of society. Next slide, David, please. You see we're going through it pretty rapidly. So what did he do? He joined the Bennett-Lapid coalition, which included the Islamist party, whose members don't serve in the IDF. So he left Bibi because the religious people weren't serving in the IDF, but he joined this center-left coalition, which included an Arab party who don't serve in the IDF. Another slide, please, David. So who knows which ways he's going to jump come November. Now, Lapid, with Gantz and Saar and Lieberman, still, according to current polls, still won't reach the 61 required seats for a majority. Now, he may not get there even if he tacks on Labour and Merits. In short, he can only hope that Bibi can't get to 61 votes with the religious party and possibly Yamina. So how can Bibi form a majority? Next slide, David, please. Can he form it with Yamina? Yamina in Hebrew means right. But Naftali Bennett moved the Yamina right-wing party into a strongly left-wing coalition and lost a lot of his members of the Knesset along the way. And now Yamina is led by this lady, Ayelet Shaked, who has a very difficult job in trying to save her party from extinction. Next slide, David, please. Even during the coalition, Bennett was leaking Yamina members. In other words, let me emphasize that, he was losing his own members in the coalition. This lady is Idit Silwan, who left the coalition over policies to do with religion and states that really she wanted to push, or things that they were bringing in because of the far left demand, which she disagreed with. Next slide, David. Towards the end, when the coalition had already lost their majority and were teetering on 60 seats, this gentleman here, Nir Orbach, had a couple of meetings with Naftali Bennett. And after the Knesset failed to pass a bill applying Israeli law to settlers in Judea and Samaria, he walked out. And this is actually the straw that broke the Bennett's camel back, because after he did that, Bennett announced his resignation. Next slide, David. So you would think that with all Yamina has to do is to go back into its political origins on the center right, and they would be safe. But at least one Yamina member of the Knesset, this gentleman here, Matan Kahana, has announced that he will not sit in a government led by Benjamin Netanyahu. So what would happen if Yamina gets, say, 4 or 5 mandates, which would put them in the Knesset, and 1 or 2 Yamina members of the Knesset refuse to allow Ayelet Shaked to negotiate Yamina sitting in the government under Bibi? Even if Bibi makes Shaked an offer she can't refuse, like, for instance, being a deputy prime minister. Watch this space. We've still got a few months to go. And that's one of the key questions that's being asked over here. Next slide, David, please. One person that Bibi can rely on is this gentleman, Aryeh Deri. Now, I'm not saying this cynically, but despite repeatedly being caught with his fingers in the cookie jar, and even having a criminal case brought against him, Deri heads a very loyal Shas party. Loyal as long as Bibi, for instance, gives him the senior ministries with the big budgets that he will demand. Next slide, David. The United Torah ultra-Orthodox party steadfastly relies on Netanyahu and the Likud for the money for their religious institutes and the jobs. Next slide, David. I think we're going through it pretty quickly, but again, I'm giving you the background to some of the factors at play over here. And I don't know if you're aware about this, but you need to be aware of these are the factors that are sort of the shifting sands of Israeli politics right now. The religious party are really leaking votes, mainly from their younger members, to the ideological religious Zionist party. This party is passionately a pro-Zionist faction, passionately for holding on to support of the biblical heartland of the land of Israel, passionately pro-settler movement, and equally passionately anti-Palestinian. Now, in my opinion, they could have been better led, but they have Bezalel Smotrich, the guy with the beard, and Itamar Ben-Gvir at the helm, making it an explosive political party. Some people say that Itamar Ben-Gvir, both of them, but particularly Itamar Ben-Gvir, is an out-and-out anti-Arab racist. He puts it that he doesn't call for death for the Arabs, he calls death for terrorists. The jury's still out on that one. However, I come back to my position that there is a need for a very strong religious or even not religious Zionist party looking after the interest of the Judea and Samaria and the heartland of Israel. I'll come to that point later. Next slide, David, please. Netanyahu also had a problem on the left side of his efforts to gain a majority of 61. Despite insulting Mansour Abbas, this is the gentleman you can see in the picture. He is the leader of RAM, which is the Arab Israeli Islamist party. He has in the past tried negotiating with them. He tried negotiating them prior to the creation of the coalition. So now he tends to be saying about Lapid can't create any coalition without the anti-Israel Israelis. But I have to tell you that in the past, Bibi had a number of closed-door sessions with Mansour Abbas, and I guarantee you, as we get towards August, September, October, prior to the election, he will be having closed-door covert meetings with Mansour Abbas as well. Now, again, this is to do with it. The question is, how would he bring the RAM into his government without losing, for instance, the religious Zionist. So this is the delicate balance that even Bibi finds himself in right now. Next slide. One after that, we'll go to the next one. I want to tell you, oh no, sorry, the one before that, David, sorry about that. Let's go here. I mentioned about Bibi in closed meetings with Mansour Abbas, but in my opinion, Mansour Abbas has proven to be himself to be a deft politician, a deft, D-E-F-T politician in the last coalition. He was certainly doing things on behalf of the Arabs and certainly to do with getting budgets on behalf of the Bedouin, representing their interest. He didn't make any waves. He behaved like we expect to have an Arab Knesset member behave. And he made it look as if he was renting a party that was more pro-Israel than, for instance, let's go on to the next slide now, David, for instance, the joint list bloc of Ayman Odeh and Ahmed Tibi, who even in the Knesset talk and act like the forward guard of the Palestinian Authority, rather than representing the best interest of the Israeli Arabs. And this brings us into potential problem, current problem, present problem, not just a future one. There are thousands and tens of thousands of Arabs who feel themselves to be loyal members of Israel and Israeli Arabs. I think they need a party in order to represent them. Next slide, please, David. I have a feeling, look, there's going to be a lot more twists and turns before we get to the election, more intrigues in the weeks to come, and more politicians trying to take advantage of having two or more parties combined together in collective strength, when truth be told, none of them are truly wanted by the voting public. And my personal take on this, even with all the parties, I think that this space in the Knesset for a couple of new parties that are missing, and I think needed in Israel. I mentioned before, I think the time has come for an Israeli Arab party. And I meant the word Israeli Arab party. By that, I mean a party representing the Arabs that are proud, happy to be Israelis, who are willing to serve even in the IDF, who would work or would like to work in the Israeli workforce. We know as we go about our daily lives, we see Arab doctors, Arab nurses, and people like that representing the Druze, Bedouin, Arab society. We know, I know in particular because I'm involved with them, members of the Aramean Christian communities, the Bedouin, the Druze, the Aramean Christians who actually join in some of the elite units, both in the IDF and also in the police, who want their communities served, but also want their communities improved to enjoy the safety and prosperity of life in Israel. And this includes a proper Israeli education for their children and opening them up into the Israeli startup high-tech world. I think there's also a need for a more intelligent Zionist party, perhaps with people from organizations like Regavim in Pirzu, Abit Konistim, which are former IDF and intelligence officers who really believe we can get peace, but with absolutely safe, locked in safe and secure boundaries or borders for Israel, integral for the state of Israel. And that doesn't have to be seen as as simply as a right-wing party. I think this is something that is central to Israel. Representatives who, in my opinion, for instance, can share the Rabin doctrine of a safe Israel with safe and secure borders, for instance, having the Jordan Valley and controlling the high ground towards the east, and also controlling the high ground towards the west in order, the hills of Shomron, with the narrow coastal plains lying below. And this party should also push major developments of the Negev, a project that should have been started decades ago, but the governments have always said they didn't have the budget and hadn't come up with the actual final details of the project. I think this is not a right-wing idea. It reflects the vision of David Ben-Gurion, who lived and died in the Negev and is buried in kibbutz Sde Boker. So I think there is no, even though you may think from over there in Australia there are too many parties, yeah, there are some, in my opinion, to outlive their usefulness, and I think they could be replaced by staunchly Israeli and Zionist parties as well, without losing anything and without getting into a divided country. That's all I have to say on the election. I hope it was detailed enough, or maybe you could probably, a lot of you may be sort of dazzled and by the directions I've taken you in. If you've got any questions, I'm here to answer.
Thanks, Barry. Yes, it was rather dazzling, but very, very complete. Thank you very much. Just before we go to questions, and we have got a few hands up, I will mention that if you're listening on J-Air, this is the Australian Jewish Association Zoom event, which we have every Wednesday night. Our guest tonight is Barry Shaw, and as you will have heard, it's all about the upcoming Israeli election. I'm just going to hand over to David very briefly to tell us what's coming up next week. Thanks, David.
Thank you so much, Alan. And we had as one of the descriptors for tonight's event a balagan, and I don't think Barry's done anything to dissuade the appropriateness of that description. As we do every week, if there's anyone here who's not yet supporting AJA, we need you to engage. We need you to do something tangible. After our event, please go to the website jewishassociation.org.au, where you can apply for membership, you can join the email list, you can make a donation, and of course, like and follow the AJA Facebook page for news and views on a daily basis. And Barry almost hinted at an issue that we will actually be dealing with in detail next week, and that is Jewish communities in Judea Samaria. We have the Director of Foreign Relations of the Nahala settlement movement joining us, Lital, and I think AJA would probably be the only organisation in Australia that would hold this particular discussion about the right of Jewish communities in Judea Samaria and how they are established.
Okay, thanks, David. We've got some hands up. I've got Michael, Ron, Rod, Leon. Just before we go to the guys, Barry, I just want to ask you a question, and you spoke a bit about Bibi Netanyahu, which is just a fascinating subject in itself. My question is, do the right-wing people that hate him so much, do they believe that he is inherently evil and corrupt, or do they just not like him because he's such a difficult rival to fight within their industry?
Yeah, good question. And they absolutely don't think he's corrupt at all. I think one of the things where Bibi got it wrong, and I think he lost the last election, in my opinion, more because of his hubris. How do I explain that? He put himself in a position of power. But one of the things personally that I didn't like about Bibi's way of governing is I noticed if there was any intelligent, talented, younger members of the Likud who were given ministries and made a success of them and really became prominent, Bibi had a habit of pushing them aside or even sending them abroad. I don't know why he looks at that as if these people might become challengers for the head of the Likud party, because I think these people were all loyal to him. They were all successful. I'll give you a couple of examples. There was Danny Danon, and there was also Gilad Erdan, who was shipped off to America. There was one or two people left earlier on. There were people like Benny Begin and Dan Meridor who left the Likud party in the Knesset. They remained Likudniks, but they left the party mainly because of they knew that the Bibi wouldn't vote them anymore. We just had another one, Yuval Steinitz, who was a very successful science minister who negotiated the natural gas deal. First of all, it was supposed to be with Turkey, and then they revised into one with Greece and Cyprus, and now a new one where we're doing it with Greece, Cyprus, and Egypt. And he was a modest guy. He wasn't angling to be head of the Likud party like more of the people do, but he had a successful record, and he just announced that he's leaving politics. Another one who I think was capable of being a leader in the Likud in the future would be Nir Barkat, who was the mayor of Jerusalem, a millionaire in his own right because of high tech, and he's been attracting high tech to Jerusalem. And also Bibi keeps him at arm's length because he looks as a challenger. But the other thing to do with the hubris that a lot of people got on is there is something going on that people believe that he isolated himself, not only from members of his own party, but he was also angling to make sure that he was getting favorable coverage in the newspapers. There was something going on. That's why we're waiting for the next case that against Noni Moses of the Yediot Achronot, which might be the most serious one he's facing. But the final thing was that he was behaving, him and his wife, and this is why I talk about hubris, that got to be a little bit obnoxious for Israelis, even the Israelis who supported him and support his sort of politics. He even paid, I can't remember how many hundreds of millions of shekels or dollars for a new, almost like presidential plane. So he and his wife, if you're going to go abroad, would ascend like Air Force One Israeli style. Also, Israeli got upset that when we see the world's prime ministers go around the world, they're not accompanied by the First Lady, but Bibi always is. People, and there's a lot of rumors and murmurs going on, that this is one of the conditions that Sarah and Netanyahu made, that she didn't trust her husband when he goes aboard with his wandering eye, but insisted that she had to go with him to keep an eye on him. I don't know, but these are the sort of gossips that these sort of things lead to. And if we come back to power, one of the things he has to do is leave his wife behind, because she might behave like the First Lady of the United States as they ascend the staircase going into Air Force One Israel style, with her waving to the media and everything. But she's not a politician, for heaven's sake. She's the wife of the prime minister. And Israel has never had that. And quite frankly, a lot of Israelis find it obnoxious.
Okay.
But having said that, he may be the right man at the right time if we're coming into two issues. One is to do with what Lapid and Benny Gantz are doing in the Judea and Samaria, which is not very popular. And it may be the factor that might make people move away from the Gantz Sar coalition, because Gantz, he was the chief of staff, he's the current defense minister, but he has moved too far to the left too quickly for a lot of Israeli taste. If you're talking about the Shtachim, this is something you should look into for that particular program. But the other thing is also, they have, again, some of the things that they have said during Biden's visit as well, which is a bit disturbing.
Okay, we might come back to that a little later, but Michael, you're up next. Please unmute yourself, and then Ron.
Yes, hi Barry.
Hello.
Yeah, thanks for the breakfast. It was beautiful last week.
I enjoyed your company.
I owe you one. Now, just slightly unrelated to the immediate politics, but a very important issue, the Abraham Accords, which I believe mainly due to the Arab countries that have joined the fear of the common enemy of Iran. I was just reading a couple of days ago that the UAE, which is one of the strongest in the Accords, is sending an envoy to Iran, and even considering sending their ambassador and seeking to rebuild ties. My concern about the Abraham Accords is if countries like UAE suddenly make some sort of peace agreements with Iran, is it likely that these Arab countries will just drop the Abraham Accords because they're no longer the reason? What's your thinking long term?
Well, this is a result of the Biden visit, and I'll talk about that later and how the connection is made. But to answer your question is, yes, they are making approaches to do with Iran, and no, they will not stop their connections with Israel via the Abraham Accords, because they need the innovations that Israel and only Israel can offer them, and Iran certainly can't offer them, which includes not just agriculture, high-tech, science, medicine, but also certain military things as well, which we can't really talk about publicly, that they can only get from Israel and need from Israel, basically to protect themselves from Iran. They're not going to go lovey-lovey with Iran, but they're keeping the options open. And part of the reason for you hearing about this is basically as a result of Biden's visit, which I'll explain later.
Okay. Ron, please unmute yourself.
Sorry?
Yeah, hi. Hi, good evening, Barry. Good evening.
Hello.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I would like to, from what you described, lots of the dysfunction of the current Israeli government has to do with personalities rather than pure policies as well. So I'm just wondering, do you think that the next election, if you take it down to the nitty-gritty, would be Zionist versus post-Zionist parties? If you take it down to the wire, would you agree with that?
Yes, there's a lot to do with that, and this is the part that worries me. There's also a number of parties that have come up that are based strongly on the strength of the personality of the leader, and they bring some of their underlings with them. And the more successful, or the more long-lasting ones, let's say, are the ones that cozy up to the Likud, in particular Bibi in the past, because if they're going to be loyal to Bibi, then they could be assured of ministries and large budgets and things like this. But I like your expression, post-Zionist. And a perfect example of that is one that I referred to earlier, which is the Labour Party. And the way that Amir Peretz before her and Merav Michaeli has taken the Labour Party. And I think it is tragic to see what has happened with Labour Party, which was the founding party of the Zionist state of Israel under Ben-Gurion, Levi Eshkol and others as well. They've totally lost their way. And this, and what the thing to look out for is you will hear, I am sure, within the next month or so, that the Labour Party will link up with the Zava Golan in the Meretz Party, which is virtually a Marxist communist party. So they moved, the Communist Party have moved slightly to the right of communist, but Merav Michaeli has moved the Labour Party inching closer to the Marxist sort of party as well. So this is, in my opinion, unless some true blood traditional Labour politician comes along, is the death knell of the founding party of the state of Israel, the Labour Party.
Okay, Rod, your turn. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. Rod, are you there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes. Good, thanks.
Thanks for your presentation, Barry. I just wanted to ask, we hear a lot about left and right in Israel, and it seems to be related to settlements and accords with the Palestinians or foreign policy, perhaps. But where are the sort of left and right, as we would know it in Britain or Australia? Are there political movements that are dealing with the sort of things that would be the normal bread and butter of, say, the Conservatives and the Labor Party in Britain, and or there's, as in similar in Australia?
If you look at the statistics in the past, and I'm sure it's going to be the same in November, that I would say that 60% of Israel are right-wing. I'm not going to say far right-wing, it could be center-right, it could be some far-right, and some in between. And you'll see this, I'm sure, when you come to the actual voting come November. Even if Bibi can't put a coalition together of 61 seats, it probably is that there are still some right-wing people, center-right, let me put it that way, who, you know, are saying enough of Bibi. They would like to have a right-wing party, more center-right of the Likud, but not with Bibi. And this is where they're hanging out in other parties, whether it be Yamina or whether it be a Gidon Saar's party. Some of them, I think, went into Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party. But I think those people may be a little bit upset by the way that Benny Gantz has been, some of the actions Benny Gantz has taken fairly recently in what some people say unnecessarily gifting Mahmoud Abbas the over 10,000 square dunam of land east of Jerusalem to build 4,000 Palestinian homes, which will isolate a number of small towns and settlements, almost like detach them, if you want, from Jerusalem. That was too soon, too fast, without getting any concessions from the Palestinians. I think a lot of the people who are center-right think, okay, let's make certain concessions to the Palestinians only after the Palestinians make concessions to Israel, like, for instance, recognizing Israel's right to exist as the Jewish homeland of the homeland of the Jewish people. But this battle is still being waged. So for people like Benny Gantz to make this, do this, the timing was wrong. It was very badly received. And I think that his party, the reason he's going into a coalition with Saar is because he feels he will be leaking a lot of people who are center-right, but attracting some people from the Labour Party, for instance, to him. And this is why the Labour Party will be leaking as well. So Benny Gantz, I think, he's moved from center to the left. And but however, the heartland in Israel is probably still at this time 60% at least right or center-right. And I still have a suspicion that we could add about 5, 6, 7% to that if they really dug down into what I call the minority population of Israel, whether they are the Arabs, the Druze, some of the Bedouins, the Maronites, or whatever. I did an interview with a young guy who is a Christian whose parents came from Lebanon, and he's very much center-right. And I know other people as well. I know a young lady who's been trying to become, she's always voted, she's an Arab, she's always voted Likud. She tries to get into, make it the cut into, and try and make the case that Likud ought to have Arab members of the Knesset who are passionately pro-Israel. So there's a lot of this going on. So I would say the 60% that I know, and probably 5 or 6% that are hidden in the weeds there somewhere.
Okay, Leon, your turn. Please unmute yourself. Leon. Okay, while we're waiting for Leon, now Robert from the AJA has got a couple of written questions. So Robert, please unmute yourself and you can ask yours.
Yeah, it's just a couple of questions. What's the equivalent to the Greens? Is there a party that focuses on climate change, on energy, which seem to be big issues in Australia? Is that a concern in Israel?
As far as climate change is concerned, the clean environment, clean energy, Israel is a startup nation. We've got the technology that's ahead of the world on a lot of this right now. This is the technology. Well, recently we just did a deal with with Morocco. We've done with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain as well. And there's talk going on behind the scenes that we're going to be doing something with Saudi Arabia as well, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia isn't a member of the Abraham Accords.
Okay, Leon, I think you're ready to go. Please ask your question.
Oh, Barry, can you hear me?
Yes,
I
we do.
can.
Barry, do you think there's been an erosion of the boundary between the legislative and the judicial branches of government in Israel? And if so, do you think that the multiplicity of parties has allowed this to happen?
No, I don't think the legislature, if you're talking about the justice ministers or whatever, or you're talking about the Knesset. Leon?
No, he's gone, Barry.
Okay, well, let me put it this way. If you're talking about the Knesset, you have to remember, I think about explain, this is why it's getting complicated, that if you've got a democracy there in Australia, we've got a democracy on steroids. This is where you've got where 80% of the decision makers are Jewish, and you know the whole spectrum you've got of Judaism from left to right or whatever. And this obviously leads to multi-parties, everyone representing their own collective interests. I suppose you look at it one way, it's a sign of a healthy democracy. On the other way, we have an Australian word, I think it's an Aboriginal word called, it ends up with balagan.
Yeah, but has the High Court of Justice encroached too much on the powers of the Knesset, do you think?
Israel firmly believes that the justice, the ministries, the court should stay out of politics.
But has the High Court of Justice actually stayed out of politics? Many Israelis claim that it hasn't.
That's true, and this is one of the claims that Benjamin Netanyahu is making, that the members of the judiciary have been engaging in biased politics against him. Rather like a lot of people are saying in America right now that not so much the Supreme Court, they're not doing it, but certainly that a lot of people in the Congress are using politics right now as we speak in order to bring in sorts of legislation that would prevent the former president of the United States from running again in 2024. This is partly a more diluted way of what Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying about legislative that's going on over here. And it seems that from one or two of the cases that that have been disproven, and a lot of the evidence that has been dismissed, now it came to the court, that there was a certain amount of a stitch-up job being done against Bibi in one or two of the cases being made against him right now, like the current one that's going on with the champagne and the gifts to Bibi and his wife from close friends and people who have been close friends for a long time. And there's not been any case made really that stuck, that any of these people gave him gifts other than as a friendship gesture, or exceeding some of the demands from Bibi and his wife, that rather than receiving political favors or personal favors in return for these gifts. That was not proved.
Okay, well, I want to touch on the Biden visit, Barry, but just Grant, if you've got a very quick question, we'll take that. Please unmute yourself, or we might go straight. Okay, go fire away.
Yep, hang on, where's the video? There it is. Okay, hi. Thanks, Barry. I just wanted to ask a quick question. So there's heaps of elections. Do people change their votes between the different elections? And the second question is, it's very expensive. We know how expensive it is here in Australia. Who's paying for all these elections? And what's the impost on Israeli citizens having so many elections? It's too much money.
My feeling is that a lot of Israelis are disillusioned, and I think the turnout might be very low in this November election. Because it was this election was something we didn't need at all, especially with the economic problems and inflation and other things going on in Israel right now. There are other problems that need to go out rather than to have these politicians spending, like you mentioned before, hundreds of millions of shekels on their personal political careers or whatever. I'm not sure I'm not sure. I don't see. I hope you'll have me on the show closer to November 1st when we're having it, because the situation might be clearer. But as we stand right now, and there's a long way to go, there's going to be a lot of horse trading going on. But quite frankly, a lot of people over here believe that it's going to be very difficult for either Bibi on the right or Yair Lapid on the left. Producing a government with the majority, it's going to be razor slim. And I don't know of any new change that's about to come onto the stage in the next few months that's going to change my thinking. And quite frankly, if we were going to find after the horse trading that goes on behind the scenes after the results are in, that neither of the major parties can put a coalition together, it means we're going to have to have another election probably about March or April next year.
No. Barry, just before we need to finish up shortly, but just give us your take on the President Biden visit of Israel. What did you make of it all? Would you call it a success? And how do you think it will impact in the future?
I'm going to keep it succinct as I can because I don't think we've got time. But I want to tell you the fallout of the Biden visit. I have many thoughts about Biden's visit to Israel and Saudi Arabia, but my main conclusion is this. It was clear before his arrival that his presidency has been a disaster for America. He's taken America internally to a very dangerous place, I believe, both economically, spiritually, and politically. America has a cult that blames America first and Israel second. And here in Israel, I saw an aging president fixated on a mantra that has been repeating for 50 years. And in his dotage, he's unable to change the tape. In Israel, Biden heard in stereo that to show Iran, the need to show Iran that there's a credible military option that will be used if they don't back down from their pursuit of a nuclear weapon. Now, Biden heard it in stereo, like I said, from Lapid on the left and Gantz on the left, and also from Bibi on the right. And yet Biden's response was the old mantra that he still prefers the diplomatic trap. Lapid, to his credit, told him to his face openly and publicly, based into our intelligence, the time for diplomacy is finished. Yet Biden kept on bleating on that, and he still prefers that option. Now, Israel and the Sunni states, this comes back to a question one of your questioners asked, took note of this, that the US president doesn't listen and is unable to recalibrate his opinion even after being given evidence that prove his ideas to be wrong. And within days of Biden leaving the Middle East, the IDF chief of staff, Aviv Kohavi, who is now in Morocco as I talk to you, announced that an attack on Iran is the center of Israel's military plans. He would not have made this announcement without the approval of the Israeli Security Council. It was a message to Biden, his State Department, that we heard what he said and we're putting Iran front and central. If Biden is not ready to talk about a credible military option, Israel is, up to a point. Israel has to be made very worried when Israel, instead of talking about it, goes into a silent mode. Because when you don't hear anything from the Security Council, our military and our politicians, that's the time you know that something is in the works.
Yeah, most people would say that Biden is not as cognitively strong as he may have once been. Did that come across during the visit?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he talked about honoring the Holocaust as if it's something you should honor and repeat. But even more telling, Alan, is this. We were hearing Biden go on about the only solution to the Palestinian problem is a two-state solution or non-existing 1967 borders. This is nonsense, and it's been dead for 50 years. There are other alternatives, but those are not worth pursuing as long as until the Israel camp can get their act together and also show us that they're prepared for a pragmatic compromise is something they've not been able to do and not willing to do. And if any of you have been following my interviews on The View from Israel, you will have heard hands-on experts tell you that Hamas is increasingly controlling the Palestinian streets, and they're unrelenting in seeing a world without Israel. And the aging Mahmoud Abbas is running and puffing to keep up with Hamas, basically, in his incitement and indoctrination against Israel and the Jews. And Biden does nothing to deprive him of this dangerous nonsense. Yet that's where the obstacle lies. And the worst thing about it is because the Arabs, even the ones in the Abraham Accords, were hearing him say this. And when he went to Saudi Arabia, what do we hear? We heard that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain said there won't be a definite agreement and recognition of Israel, even with the Abraham Accords, until there's a two-state solution. And this was repeated again by the leaders of Saudi Arabia. They were echoing Biden's words. So quite frankly, in my opinion, Biden set back an alternative for peace with the Palestinians, which we could have done with the Arab world in and just outside the Abraham Accords, who have had it themselves up to the Palestinians, who know the corruption of the Mahmoud Abbas's Palestinian Authority, who fear Hamas, who are being sponsored and paid, and they're a proxy of Iran. They're scared about that. And if Biden hadn't opened his mouth, I think he set back the alternative to a dead two-state solution for perhaps another 40, 50 years.
But Barry, the fact that both left and right in Israel are saying the same thing as far as Iran, is that something to be optimistic about?
Of course. And you know, it's one thing that we're waiting for some of the Arab members of the Knesset, as they often told in the Knesset, when Iran explodes their nuclear missile on top of Israel, the missile doesn't recognize Arabs or Jews. It kills everybody together. And yet there are still members of the Knesset on the Arab side who are supportive of Iran, as well as they are supportive of Hamas and even the terrorism under the Palestinian Authority.
Okay. Yes, okay, look, we do need to leave it there. We've gone a couple of minutes over, but Barry, look, you're a breath of fresh air. You've been wonderfully informative to us tonight. Just tell people where they can follow you if they want to hear and read more about what you're doing.
Well, you can find me on a lot of social media, everything from Twitter, Facebook, Gab, LinkedIn, who have I forgotten? I forgot, whatever they are. You can get me on that. You can get me at theviewfromisrael@gmail.com. And you can find my books, which are very informative, on Amazon. And if you have any questions, or if you're countering a lot of the lies and defamation of the anti-Israel activists, even in Australia, and you're looking for answers to hit back at them, contact me either on social media or by email. I'll be very happy to give you some facts and information of how to defy the BDS movement, because I wrote about it in one of my books, BDS are idiots.
Yes, it's a great book. Okay, Barry, look, thanks so much again for joining us. We wish you all the best and continue telling the truth in all of your forums. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, and thank you to the audience for the questions.
Okay, just before we go, the L'chaim program with Morris Klein is on right now on 3ZZZ. That's all we've got for tonight. Join us next week with Lital Slonim from the Nachalah movement. Don't forget, you can keep up to date with what AJA is talking about on our Facebook page. Please like it and share it widely. But for now, we wish you all a very good evening and look forward to seeing you next week as usual. So from me, it's good night to you all. Bye for now.